How you doing? Long time no see, J Street. We don't have a lot to vamp on here, so why don't we just get right to it? We'd like to introduce the senior senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar.
Group. Thank you.
Senator, slow news day today. You may have noticed. This morning, President Trump announced that the U.S. military conducted an operation to take out Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. You can clap for that. Curious if you had any reaction to Baghdadi's demise, or the way this operation unfolded based on early reports.
Sure. Well, I think it is good for our country, good for the world. He was a heinous terrorist responsible for the death of so many innocent people. And I think it's important to say that today. But I also think it's important to talk more broadly about what's going on and what just happened over the last few weeks with Syria and the president's policy. And what has happened, and Ben is aware of this, during the last few years of the Obama administration, and I know you worked on this, as well as the last years under the Trump administration, our military and the people that were stationed there have worked with the Kurds and worked to reduce the ISIS presence there in a major way, and that was a really good thing. The Kurds lost over 11,000 people. And to think that this president then, with one phone call from Erdogan, made this decision to leave our allies for slaughter, leave this area void to be filled in by Russia, and despite the important work that was done with regard to al-Baghdadi, what they just did, despite that, the fact is that over 100, and this is according to the head of our Defense Department, over 100 ISIS fighters got out. There's a prison that no one seems to know who's guarding right now. And there is just big trouble ahead because of the foothold that Iran is now going to have in Syria. So when you think of it from an Israeli perspective, and you think of it from the perspective of our allies, once again, this president has chosen to let Russia have a lead, and then has again backed away from our allies. It's a pattern that we see all over the world. It's what we saw that he did when he believed Putin over his own intelligence heads. It's what we saw that he did when he got us out of the International Climate Change Agreement, leaving our world and leaving every single country in that agreement except the U.S. And when you see how he dealt with Kim Jong-un, where he thought he could just bring a hot dish to his dictator next door and try to make a deal, when in fact he had no focus on what those results should be.
So let's talk about the U.S.-Israel relationship. So the first piece of legislation the Senate drafted was S1, which was a whole bunch of legislation that sort of squeezed together funding for Israel, something like Jordan, I believe. And then it also included the Combating BDS Act, which was designed to give states legal cover for laws that they had passed that forbid state entities from contracting or investing with entities that boycott Israel. It basically, lets states punish companies that participate in BDS. Some of your opponents in this race, like Bernie Sanders, have said that S1 violates the First Amendment rights. The ACLU has taken no position on BDS generally, but has said that they believe that boycotts are protected speech. Do you disagree with that argument?
Well, first of all, as you know, I voted for that bill, and I did it because it included the $38 billion of aid to Israel. And when I voted for the Iranian nuclear agreement, which I thought was very important, to the security of our world. And I know Ben and I talked about this at the time, as I also talked with President Obama. One of the things that was most important to me and that I publicly stated at the time is, given that Iran was going to get some funding release and money released out of this, that we made sure that we continued the funding for Israel. So that was my primary reason for voting for that, as was a number of other senators that I think you like in this room, including many J Street endorsed senators when they voted for it. Now, the BDS portion, while it did say that it would not violate the First Amendment, I think that it would have been much better to use some of the negotiation that was going on at the time involving some other bills and other things we could have done. And to me, that vote, while it was a difficult one for a lot of people, it just showed to me what Mitch McConnell is trying to do all the time. Instead of bringing people together for support of Israel on a bipartisan basis, he and President Trump are always looking for those wedges, a way to do things that creates wedges instead of bringing people together. And I think it has been very negative. And I'm not just talking about one vote. I'm talking about how the Prime Minister's visit was handled, as everyone remembers that. I'm talking about how President Trump has supported some of the Prime Minister's moves and claims during the election that I disagreed with. And I think all of this is resulting in a loss of support for Israel that's very bad. As someone that views Israel as our beacon of democracy, as I said in the debate, in the Mideast, in an incomparably tough neighborhood, I think it is important that we build support in the U.S. And the way I would do it as president is to not only focus on a two-state solution, but also to emphasize and bring in some of the good work that Israel has done when it comes to climate change and renewable energy, when it comes to women's rights, in a neighborhood where a lot of those other countries are not respecting women's rights in the same way that Israel does. And I think it's really important to bring young people into this discussion and talk about this in a different way. And it has been just heartbreaking to me the way this president has responded and has actually whittled away at support for Israel while he claims that he's trying to support Israel. I would be a much different voice, and one of my major policy priorities would be to bring back that kind of support for Israel that is so important for the future of Israel and our relations with Israel.
So, one of the issues you just touched on was Iran, and you were a very important supporter of the Iran deal in the Senate. You deserve a lot of credit for that, and J Street too helped us. I did want to ask you. You've said that you support trying to secure an expanded nuclear agreement that goes beyond the provisions in the current deal. I think one very important question, and I think everybody would agree that it'd be better to have certain other provisions added on to it. The question I have is, would you though approach that as something you would do after you re-enter, if we could get back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, and get those protections back in place, which Iran has started to violate after we pulled out? Would you try to start from the foundation of let's go back into the existing deal and then negotiate add-on provisions, or would you seek instead to negotiate a new agreement?
I'm trying to picture what you would say if you were up here and President Obama was still in the White House. I think I'm only smiling because I think it's very important that we don't negotiate on stage before I'm even president. But I do think that we need to get back in that agreement. And I think one of the things that would be good to change are the sunset provisions. And now that we have had a few years before President Trump precipitously took us out of that agreement, and in doing so, left our allies in Europe holding the bag and gave all this leverage to China and to Russia, which is the last thing we should be doing. that we must start those negotiations again to get back in the agreement. And I don't think any of the outcomes that we've seen in the last few months should be a surprise, whether it was what Iran has been doing when it came, the reported attacks on Saudi Arabia, the oil field, or when it's come to some of these other things. None of it should be a surprise. And the irony that he took 150 troops out of Syria that were helping protect our allies, and then has added thousands of troops because of his decision to get out of the Iranian agreement, and what that has caused for risk of security is something that I look forward to debating him on the stage about, because I don't think he has made America safer. He certainly hasn't made Israel safer. He's made both countries less safe.
One of the, obviously we're in this much more difficult status quo now, with Iran having begun to reaccumulate nuclear material, threatening to take other steps. One of the difficult things confronting anybody walking into that office is going to be the hit to U.S. credibility from withdrawing from all the agreements that you mentioned. And to deal with the Iran piece of this, you obviously still need to work with the European countries, Russia and China. How do you approach the issue of restoring credibility with those countries that we can be trusted to keep agreements, that they should get behind U.S. leadership on a complicated piece of business like the Iran nuclear agreement, where Russia might have a different interest than ours, but we frankly need their, or would benefit from their cooperation? What is and how do we get our allies in Europe to trust that if they follow U.S. leadership again, we won't do what we did last time, which is pull out? I mean, how would you approach this issue of the Iran agreement in particular, but more broadly, how do we restore that credibility that the United States is somebody who can be trusted to keep agreements?
First of all, you show your allies that you have their backs. And time again, he hasn't done that. I was thinking of the recent tweet. Oh, one thing I'd stop is the mean tweets. Okay, that would be the first thing. The second thing is when you think about what he did just recently with ISIS, when he said, well, yeah, they're not going to attack us. Maybe they go to Europe. Seriously? How do you think France felt? How do you think these other countries felt? But President Trump did that. So I think it's going to be really important. As I've said, in my first 100 days, I would go and meet with these leaders, go to these countries, because I think that we need to repair our reputation around the world. We need to repair our own diplomatic corps and our State Department that he has brought down to a place where I don't think they ever thought they'd been. So many of them have worked there through Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, and while they may have had their own personal view about these presidents, they always felt that their job was to represent their country, and they would do that. And he has really torn away at the core of what being a diplomat is all about, as we've seen recently from the testimony from some of the diplomats that have come forward. So I think building up the State Department and making clear to those other countries around the world that you're going to have a professional State Department, putting in ambassadors that are trusted in those countries, making sure that we re-enter these agreements. And I mentioned not just the Iran agreement, but the climate change agreement. And when he got us out of that agreement, there were only two countries that weren't in it, Nicaragua and Syria. They are now in the agreement. So we are the only ones not in it, as we are seeing such a threat to our world security with the fires you're seeing right now in California, but rising floods, the floods that we just saw in the middle of the country. This is not just anymore something that's just happening on the coast. It's happening all over the U.S. and all over the world. The Russian nuclear agreement. So we know Russia was cheating, but yet he got us out of that agreement without even trying to negotiate back into the agreement. And we're going to have the New START agreement coming up right at the beginning of the term of a new president. These are all things you could do to build credibility with our allies. And then the last thing that I would say is just the rhetoric against people. in our own country and across the world. I remember at the height of the campaign, the last presidential campaign, when I heard the story actually at a mosque in Minneapolis of a family that went out to dinner at that time. And this guy walks by, and the parents had never experienced any discrimination even during 9/11, they had told us. And they were at dinner with their 2 young kids, and this guy walks by and he says, "You 4 go home. You go home to where you came from." They're Somalis. And the little girl looked up at her mom and she said, "Mom, I don't want to go home for dinner. You said we could eat out tonight." You think of the words of that innocent child. She only knows one home. That's my state. She only knows one home. That is our country. And as we see this rise of anti-Semitism, and we see this white nationalism, and we see the hate crimes against all communities, including the Muslim community, the Jewish community, really anyone that looks different, at some point you have to hold people responsible for the rhetoric and how that has filtered down to people that have these instincts to begin with. And so I think one of the things we could really do to bring the world with us and to reach out is to actually start right at home in how we treat our own citizens and our own immigrants in our own country.
So recently, Senator Warren and Mayor Pete Buttigieg said they were open to the idea of conditioning some U.S. assistance to Israel if Israel either annexes the West Bank or if there's continued settlement construction. We know that Bibi Netanyahu has talked about annexing the Jordan Valley. Data collected in East Jerusalem shows a spike in settlement construction. Would you be open to conditioning aid or withholding aid as leverage to prevent annexation or stop settlement construction?
Again, I think we are at this moment in time where it's not a good idea to negotiate these things right now. But let me be very clear in how strongly I believe that promise that the Prime Minister made during his political campaign was wrong, that he was going to annex a third of the West Bank. Also, the Golan Heights and what he did there, I disagreed with that. And I also strongly disagreed when he, at President Trump's urging, said that members of Congress couldn't even visit Israel. And I appreciated J Street, AIPAC, really all the Jewish groups standing up and saying this was wrong. But time and time again, we've seen actions and words that actually hurt us toward moving to a 2-state solution. And for me, what we need to do is to get a new president, number one. Number two, be very clear that as part of our foreign policy and goal of a 2-state solution, with which the Prime Minister and the President have not emphasized, and in fact the Prime Minister at some point backed away from, as we move toward our foreign policy goal, that we play a leadership role, that we look at the economics of this and tie that in with the political solution. And one of the things that has bothered me so much with the chaos the President has caused by getting out of the Iranian agreement and boy, what he just did in Syria and how he has conducted foreign policy, it's made it much harder to focus on getting a 2-state solution and focus our State Department resources, our diplomatic corps, our economic focus internationally on getting this done, as well as, by the way, dealing with China, because he keeps causing blow-ups all over the world, even when he doesn't need to. So that's how I would do it, and I think we have to negotiate with strength, and we should do it from a position of strength. I think getting back into the Iranian nuclear agreement would also be a good sign as we look at this negotiation and standing up for Kurds and other minorities as well.
Go ahead, Ben. I think we have time for one more. So.
Yeah, sure. One way to think about this generally, beyond just a specific of conditioning assistance, is I think there's been a kind of fairly predominant view around the 2-state solution that kind of one of the roles of the United States was to make Israel feel confident and supported so that it was comfortable moving forward with that type of negotiation. In other words, to provide as much security support and try to address Israeli concerns rather than using any particular pressure on Israel. And I think it's pretty clear that has not borne out, that essentially settlement construction has expanded. The Prime Minister of Israel has become increasingly, from talking about the need for a two-state solution in 2009 to saying it won't happen on his watch. And obviously we don't know who will be the Prime Minister in 2021. But I guess the question I have is, towards the very end of the Obama administration, for instance, we abstained on a resolution on settlements at the UN. We put out some U.S. positions, which the Israeli government has not wanted us to do in the past, on issues around Jerusalem, the final status issues. If you have an Israeli government that is not showing any seriousness in pursuing a Palestinian state, do you think that U.S. pressure, whether it's aid, diplomacy, what is the balance between trying to exert some pressure on this issue to get them to take concrete steps towards a Palestinian state versus a status quo that is kind of more stepped back and left this to Israeli leaders to make the decision?
I don't think we want the status quo. I think that we want to get a two-state solution. We want peace, and there should be a way to get there. But time and time again, it gets held up. We know what's been going on. I remember being in Sderot the first time I went there and seeing, standing in front of a house where there was a hole in the roof because a rocket had been launched, and it went right through the middle of a kitchen table where a girl was doing her homework, and luckily there'd been an alert system and she got to the side. And it seems like every time we've been close, something happens. And I think you need a president that's willing to put that kind of pressure. And again, I'm not going to commit right now to what that pressure is, but it's very obvious we need to have serious discussions with the U.S. in the lead to get this done, because the Trump administration, they had that summit where neither party came. Okay, well, that's not that helpful. I just don't think they've been in any place where they could have negotiated this. When I went to Israel a few years back and met with the Prime Minister, I was the one in our delegation that also went to meet with the Palestinians. I thought it was really important to do that. And I think it is not necessarily always, going to always be exactly that you're going to identify at the outset what leverage you're going to use, but a lot of it is how you handle this and what you talk about and the fact that you're willing to negotiate in the region. But I just think allowing Iran to have a foothold in Syria, I will say this again, with Russia, does not make Israel any safer. And getting out of that agreement did not make Israel safer. And that is why I am so wedded right now to make sure that we are continuing the aid. And I think that this president has actually made things more unsafe. And one other thing that we didn't bring up today was that this is the actual anniversary of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. To take a moment to think about that and the rise of anti-Semitism and what we need to do to get to a better point in this country. And I have been actually really proud of what we've done in my state, and it's a model for me with our rabbis working with the Muslim community has been a really big deal. And we did, my favorite was during the Super Bowl when it was in Minnesota, we actually had this viral video where a rabbi, a very popular rabbi in our state, threw a pass down the field to an imam who caught it. And it went viral. But on a lot of our synagogues in the Twin Cities, when it's Ramadan, they have signs up that say Happy Ramadan. We have done a lot of education of communities, including Catholic churches, evangelical churches, other churches on different faiths, and we've really made this a priority in our state. And when calls were made to the Jewish community centers, threats, bomb threats, and they had to evacuate in the middle of a cold day with little kids who had been in a swimming pool and senior citizens, when they got back from what they called their walk in the wilderness, the first message on their messages was a message from the Islamic Center asking if they needed a place to meet. So those are things that I always cherish and I will bring with me if I'm so honored to be the president, because I think there has to be a lot more of this discussion if we are going to be able to lead internationally, not just on the two-state solution, but on all of these issues regarding world peace. And you can't do it if you can't talk the talk at home.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for being here and for your work in the Senate to push for a smarter foreign policy that emphasizes diplomacy and not more military adventures than the Middle East. Senator Klobuchar.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, J3.